Good evening. Thank you very much for coming tonight. My name is Bridget Warren. I'm one of the owners of Vertigo Books. I think it was 6 years ago, for Culture and Imperialism, we had Edward Said at our store. It was jam-packed. That's why we're here tonight, and it's gratifying to be able to present Professor Said. Before we begin, I just want to explain who we are, because I think many of you are new to Vertigo. We're an independent bookstore. We're locally owned. Our owners are white, black, Chinese, and Jewish Americans. And what we've tried to do is create a place where people can meet and discuss books and important issues across the racial, political, sexual, and sometimes generational lines that frequently divide people. Obviously, Edward Said is a popular person at our store. Your support of us tonight, rather than shopping at corporate-owned bookstores, allows us to present those voices that are also dissenting, sometimes marginalized voices that are not supported by the generous publisher and mainstream publisher that publishes Professor Said. So we thank you for that support. Tonight's event allows us to continue offering those diverse voices to the Washington area. Housekeeping details. Professor Said will talk and read from his book, and afterwards he will take questions. There will be a microphone in the center aisle. If you'd like to ask a question, we'd appreciate it if you step over there. C-SPAN is taping tonight, so they'd prefer that you not stand directly in front of their cameras, obviously. After the question and answer period, Professor Said will be signing here. If you can come to the center aisle and then exit down this aisle, that aisle, it will make the traffic flow somewhat easier. I really feel kind of foolish introducing, with a long biography, such an important man, especially since he's going to read from his memoir. So I will only ask that you welcome an important scholar and Palestinian activist to the Washington area. Edward Said.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's very kind of you. Can you hear me all right? Is this okay? No. Is this all right like this? Well, I mean, I can't speak louder. Maybe they can put the volume up. Is this all right now? Yeah, okay. Well, look, thank you very much for coming. And I just want to second what, as somebody who reads books as well as writes them, it's, independent bookstores are very important to hold on to because the chains are taking everything over, and of course they carry a lot of stuff that we don't want to read. So I think, you know, Vertigo, it plays a very important role in keeping that kind of book for the public, and not just, you know, a place to buy books, but also to talk about them and meet other people. It's quite moving to see, when I came here, people I haven't seen for many years, really, from across the seas of time, as it were, especially when you get to be to my advanced age. So to all of you that I've known in the past, I hope some of the things I'll be reading and talking about, will bring back perhaps memories of these different worlds that I've lived in and come across. I thought what I'd do is I'd talk a little bit about some of these passages I'm going to read, and then sort of link them to each other, because it's a long book. But it's important to remember that it's not a political book, and it's really about my early life and about the 3 or 4 different places I grew up in: Jerusalem, Cairo, this mountain village that my father was very attached to, but I have a feeling that, well, I certainly wasn't, in Lebanon, called Hur Shwer, where we spent many, many summers. And then finally, when I came to the United States as a schoolboy in the early 50s. So I'm going to read from bits and pieces of it, and, as I say, explain or talk about some of the passages. The book starts with a kind of reflection on the main difficulty I had in my life, which was to connect my names with myself. All families, this is the opening of the book. I'll start out by reading that. All families invent their parents and children, give each of them a story, a character, fate, and even a language. There was always something wrong with how I was invented and meant to fit in with the world of my parents and 4 sisters. Whether this was because I constantly misread my part or because of some deep flaw in my being, I could not tell for most of my early life. Sometimes I was intransigent and proud of it. At other times I seemed to myself to be nearly devoid of any character at all, timid, uncertain, without will. Yet the overriding sensation I had was of always being out of place. Thus it took me about 50 years to become accustomed to, or more exactly, to feel less uncomfortable with Edward, a foolishly English name, yoked forcibly to the unmistakably Arabic family name, Said. True, my mother told me that I had been named Edward after the Prince of Wales, who cut so fine a figure in 1935, the year of my birth, and Said was the name of various uncles and cousins. But the rationale of my name broke down both when I discovered no grandparents called Said and when I tried to connect my fancy English name with its Arabic partner. For years, and depending on the exact circumstances, I would rush past Edward and emphasize Said. At other times, I would do the reverse, or connect these two to each other so quickly that neither would be clear. The one thing I couldn't tolerate, but very often would have to endure, was the disbelieving and hence undermining reaction. Edward? Said? The travails of bearing such a name were compounded by an equally unsettling quandary when it came to language. I've never known what language I spoke first, Arabic or English, or which one was really mine beyond any doubt. What I do know, however, is that the two have always been together in my life, one resonating in the other, sometimes ironically, sometimes nostalgically, most often each correcting and commenting on the other. Each can seem like my absolutely first language, but neither is. I trace this primal instability back to my mother, whom I remember speaking to me in both English and Arabic, although she always wrote to me in English once a week, all her life, as did I, all of hers. Certain spoken phrases of hers like "Tislamli" or "Mish arfi shu bdi a'mal," dozens of them were Arabic, and I was never conscious of having to translate them, or even in cases like "Tislamli," knowing exactly what they meant. They were a part of her infinitely maternal atmosphere, which in moment of great stress, I found myself yearning for, an atmosphere dreamily seductive, then suddenly snatched away, promising in the end something never given. But woven into her Arabic speech were English words like naughty boy, and of course my name pronounced by her, Edward. I'm still haunted by the memory of the sound at exactly the same time and place of her calling me Edward, the word wafting through the dusk air at closing time of the Fish Garden, a small Zamalek park in Cairo, Gnent al-Asmak it was called, with aquarium, and of myself undecided whether to answer her back or to remain in hiding for just a while longer, enjoying the pleasure of being called, being wanted, the non-Edward part of myself taking luxurious respite by not answering until the silence of my being became unendurable. Her English deployed a rhetoric of statement and norms that has never left me. Once my mother left Arabic and spoke English, there was a more objective and serious tone that mostly banished the forgiving and mutual and musical intimacy of her first language, Arabic. At age 5 or 6, I knew that I was irremediably naughty, and at school was all manner of comparably disapproved of things like fibber and loiterer. By the time I was fully conscious of speaking English fluently, if not always correctly, I regularly referred to myself not as me, but as you. Mummy doesn't love you, naughty boy, she would say. And I would respond in half plaintive, echoing, half defiant assertion. Mummy doesn't love you, but Aunt Emilia loves you. Aunt Emilia was my mother's elderly maiden aunt who doted on me when I was a very young child. No, she doesn't, my mother persisted. All right, I said. Saleh, who was Aunt Emilia's Sudanese driver, Saleh loves you. I would conclude, rescuing something from the enveloping gloom. We lived, in my early years, we lived in Cairo as a nuclear family without any relatives. Most of our relatives were in Palestine and some in Lebanon. And so Aunt Emilia, I always remember her as being at least in her 60s, was our only family in Cairo. And she was quite a remarkable woman really played a tremendously important role in my early life. So I'd like to now read a passage about Aunt Emilia, who's really a terrific character. But let me read a little bit about my mother so you get an idea of her relationship to Aunt Emilia. In 1932, my mother was plucked from what was or was retrospectively embellished as a wonderful life. She was born in Nazareth and went to school in Beirut. A wonderful life and the success of Beirut, and returned to Dur Old Nazareth, where she was deposited into an arranged marriage with my father. No one of us today can have a full grasp of what that marriage was or how it came about, but I was trained by her, my father being generally silent on that point. My father had come to the United States as a young boy, really age 16, 1911, from Jerusalem. He was escaping the Ottoman draft and spent about 10 years in this country, a little less than 10 years, including 1 year in the armed services where he fought in France and then became an American citizen, returned to Palestine in 1920, and in 1932 married my mother. But I was trained by my mother to see that her marriage was something very difficult at first, to which she gradually adjusted over the course of nearly 40 years, and which she transformed into the main event in her life. She never worked or really studied again, except for taking French lessons in Cairo, and years later, a humanities course at her old Beirut college. There were stories of her anemia and seasickness on the honeymoon voyage. My father was about 18 or 19 years older than my mother. All of them interspersed with comments on my father's patience and kindness to her, the young, very vulnerable, and naive maiden bride. She never spoke about sex without shuddering, dislike, and discomfort. Although my father's frequent remarks about the man being a skilled horseman, the woman a subdued mare, suggested to me a basically reluctant, if also exceptionally fruitful, partnership that produced 6, but 5 surviving children. But I also never doubted that at the time of her marriage to this silent and peculiarly strong middle-aged man, she suffered a terrible blow. She was wrenched from a happy life as a student in Beirut. She was given to a much older spouse who promptly took her off to strange parts and then set her down in Cairo, a gigantic and confusing city in an unfamiliar Arab country, with her maiden aunt, Emilia she was referred to, Bedr. Emilia had come to Egypt early in the 20th century, and as my mother was to do in her own way, had hewn out a life in essentially foreign territory. Emilia's father, my great-grandfather, Yusuf Bedr, was the first native evangelical minister in Lebanon, and through him, perhaps, Emilia had been hired by the American College for Girls in Cairo, an essentially missionary establishment, as local staff to teach Arabic. She was a tiny woman, but had the strongest will of anyone I ever knew. She made the Americans call her Miss Bedr, as opposed to the patronizing title usually reserved for the natives, Ma'alm Emilia, or Teacher Emilia, and early on demonstrated her radical independence by boycotting the church services, an integral part of school and mission life. Is there a God? I asked her in 1956, a short while before her death. I very much doubt it, she said, wearily and even dismissively, with that strange finality she switched on when she no longer wished to be exercised by the topic at hand. Melia's presence in the Said family life before and after my birth was of central importance. We didn't live next to or with our relatives. We were alone as a family in Cairo, except for Melia, and later in the 40s, her sister, my grandmother Munira, who lived with us. Melia helped my mother understand the complicated Cairo social system, which was so tumultuously different from anything Hilda, my mother, had ever experienced as a sheltered girl in Nazareth and Beirut. And Melia introduced the couple to various friends of hers, mostly Copts and Syrians, Shawam, plural of Shami, whose daughters were her students. Melia didn't seem overly attentive to my sisters, but she doted on me, although she never really let herself go, as was normally the case with female family members. No effusions, extended embraces, or exaggerated declarations of ritual concern. I was uniquely conceded the right to ask her questions like, "Are you married to Saleh?" her Sudanese driver, the driver who seemed to practically live with her, and occasionally I was even allowed to look through her complicated little handbag. Between the years of 1945 and 1950, I saw her in action several times at the college. Slight and barely 5 feet tall, she always dressed in black, her hair covered with a black turban or hat, and she never wore anything on her feet except for delicate black patent leather pumps. Her gestures were economical in the extreme, and she never raised her voice nor expressed the slightest hesitation or uncertainty. She had a distinct method for every social class and subclass, but underlying each was a sense of formality that could not be violated, as well as a carefully and coldly sustained distance that allowed no one to pass beyond a point of familiarity that only she determined. She terrified maids and students. She forced even distinguished parents, including at least 2 prime ministers, to accept her strictures and judgments as unappealable and final. By her perseverance, longevity, and air of infallibility, she compelled the American teachers, also spinsters like her, to conform to her way rather than she to theirs. Through half a century at the college, she lived there as well, ruling her floor like a queen. No one ever got the better of her. She stopped teaching before I was born and became director of the college, a position created in deference to her ability to rule Egyptian students and staff as no American could. Auntie Melia took my mother in hand and showed her where to shop, where to send her children to school, whom to talk to when she needed something. She supplied her with maids, piano teachers, tutors, names of ballet schools, dressmakers, and of course, endless, very quietly stated advice. She always appeared for lunch on Tuesday, a habit begun before I was born, and continued until she left Egypt in 1953 for her brief period of retirement in Lebanon before she died in 1956. I was particularly fascinated by 2 things about her. One was her way of eating. Perhaps because of defects in her molars, tiny morsels of food were carefully deposited between her gums and her front teeth. They didn't make their way back to where they could be chewed and then swallowed. Instead, she worked on the food in the front part of her mouth by pressing it down with her tongue and then sucking from it a minuscule portion of juice and perhaps a grain of rice or a tiny chunk of meat, which she abruptly and almost imperceptibly gulped down. Then, with her fork, she extracted what was left, which always looked pretty intact to me, and laid it down precisely on the plate's far corner. By the end of the meal, which she was always the last to finish, her plate contained 7 or 8 little mounds of food, neatly ringing the surface as if they had been put there by a guileful chef. The second thing that transfixed me were her hands, always encased in black or white lace gloves, depending on the season. She wore bracelets, but not rings. Her left hand always held a small, rolled-up handkerchief in the palm next to the thumb, where she could open and re-roll it all day. Whenever she offered me candy, Bastilia, as she called it, it always emerged from the hanky, always smelling of lavender cologne, always covered in cellophane, always of some gentle, unassertive flavor like quince or tamarind. Her right hand either carried her bag or rested on it. That was Aunt Amelia. Now, I felt myself during childhood, because we moved so much and went to different schools all the time, and because my parents were very concerned as the only boy who had a tendency to wander and drift and do the wrong kinds of things, that I was really created by them. And I always felt there were two Edwards. There was Edward, the kind of official above-ground Edward, and then there was this other underground person whom nobody really could get to. And thus I became the official Edward, a creation of my parents, whose daily travails, a quite different but quite dormant inner self, was able to observe, though most of the time was powerless to help. Edward, again in quotation marks, was principally the son, then the brother, then finally the boy who went to school and unsuccessfully tried to follow or ignore and circumvent all the rules. His creation was made necessary by the fact that his parents were themselves self-creations. Two Palestinians with dramatically different backgrounds and temperaments living in colonial Cairo as members of a Christian minority within a large pond of other minorities, with only each other for support, without any precedent for what they were doing, except an odd combination of pre-war Palestinian habit, American lore picked up at random in books and magazines, and from my father's decade in the US, my mother didn't even visit America until 1948, the influence of missionaries, incompleted and hence eccentric schooling, British colonial attitudes, that represented both the lords and the general run of humankind they ruled, and finally, the style of life my parents perceived around them in Egypt, in which they tried to adapt to their special circumstances. Could Edward's position ever be anything but out of place? So that was the sensation I had as I grew up, of being a kind of outsider in these various schools I went to. The first one I went to was a school called the Gezira Preparatory School, which is at the end of our street, which contained, of course, a lot of English teachers, and some, this was in the 40s, and some English students. And very soon after I got to the school, I became a delinquent. So I'd like to report on an episode which has marked me for the rest of my life. And when I read it, you'll see why. For some infraction in class when I was 8, I was sent out of the room by one of the women teachers. There weren't any men teachers, who never used physical punishment except for a few polite taps of a ruler on our knuckles. The teacher left me outside the door, then summoned Mrs. Bullen, who was the headmistress, who, with a dour expression on her face, jostled me along to a staircase leading up from the main hall. "Come along now, Edward. You've got to see Mr. Bullen upstairs." She went up ahead of me. At the top of the stairs, she stopped, placed her hand on my left shoulder, and steered me toward a closed door. "Wait here," she said, and then entered. A moment later, she was back, signaling for me to go in. She then closed the door behind me, and I was, for the first and last time in my life, in the presence of Mr. Bullen. I was instantly frightened of this large, red-faced, sandy-haired, and silent Englishman who beckoned me towards him. Not a word passed between us as I approached him slowly, where he stood near the window. I remember a blue vest, a white shirt, suede shoes, and a long, flexible bamboo stick, something between a riding crop and a cane. I was apprehensive, but I was also aware that having reached this nadir of awfulness, I must not break down or cry. He pulled me forward by the back of my neck, which he then forced down away from him so that I was half bent over. With his other hand, he raised the stick and whacked me 3 times on the behind. There was a whistle as the stick cut the air, followed by a muffled pop as it hit me. The pain I felt was less than the anger that flushed through me with every one of Bullen's silently administered stroke. Who was this ugly brute to beat me so humiliatingly? And why did I allow myself to be so powerless, so weak, the word was beginning to acquire considerable resonance in my life, as to let him assault me with such impunity. The 5-minute experience was my sole encounter with Bullen. I knew neither his first name nor anything else about him except that he embodied my first public experience of an impersonal discipline. When the incident was brought to my parents' notice by one of the teachers, my father said to me, you see how naughty you are becoming. When will you learn? And there was not in their tone the slightest objection to the indecency of the punishment. Father, we pay a lot of money for you to go to the finest schools. Why do you waste the opportunity so? As if overlooking how he had in fact paid the Bullens to treat me in this way. Mother, Edward, why do you always get yourself into trouble like that? So I became delinquent, the Edward of punishable offenses, laziness, loitering, who was regularly expected to be caught in some specific unlicensed act and punished by being given detention, or as I grew older, a violent slap by a teacher. GPS, the name of the school, Gezira Preparatory School, gave me my first experience of an organized system set up as a colonial business by the British. And later on I found out, by chance, 40 or 50 years later, I found out that this man, Bullen, his full name was Keith Bullen, and he was a poet belonging to a group of deservedly obscure poets who flourished in wartime Cairo, called the Salamander Poets. Anyway, I won't read you about the Salamander Poets, but I get my own back at him as a literary critic, because I read and talk a little bit about his dreadful poetry. Now, the other important colonial experience I had at that time, and I think I've often referred to it as the germ of my book on Orientalism, the sense of feeling an Arab in an Arab country, but somehow, somehow criminal or somehow dominated by somebody else. A short time after I was caned, I had an even more acute and much more explicit colonial encounter. Coming home at dusk across one of the vast outlying fields of the Gezira Club, I was accosted by a brown-suited Englishman with a pith helmet on his head and a small black briefcase hanging from his bicycle handbars. This was Mr. Pilley, father of Ralph, a contemporary of mine at school. "What are you doing here, boy?" he said, in a cold, reedy voice. "Going home," I replied, trying to be calm, as he dismounted from the bicycle and walked towards me. "Don't you know you're not supposed to be here?" he asked reprovingly. I started to say something about being a member, but he cut me off. "Don't answer back, boy. Just get out and do it quickly. Arabs aren't allowed here, and you're an Arab." If I hadn't thought of myself as an Arab before, I now directly grasped the significance of the designation as truly disabling. When I told my father what Mr. Pilley had said to me, he was only mildly disquieted. "And he wouldn't believe that we were members," I pleaded. "I'll speak to Pilley about this," was my father's non-committal answer. The subject was never discussed again. Pilley had gotten away with it. I'd like now to shift to a totally different place, just read a few sentences out of the long 6th chapter, which is about the fall of Palestine, for me, in the latter part of 1947, just to give a flavor of what the place was like then. On November the 1st, 1947, my 12th birthday, I recall the puzzling vehemence with which my oldest cousins, Yusuf and George, bewailed the day, the eve of the Balfour Declaration, as the blackest day in our history. I had no idea what they were talking about, but realized it must be something of overwhelming importance. Perhaps they and my parents, sitting around the table with my birthday cake, assumed that I shouldn't be informed about something as complex as our conflict with the Zionists and the British. My parents, sisters, and I spent most of 1947 in Palestine, which we left for the last time in December of that year. As a consequence, I missed several months of school in Cairo and was enrolled at St. George's School in Jerusalem. The signs of impending crisis were all around us. The city had been divided into zones, maintained by British Army and police checkpoints, through which cars, pedestrians, and cyclists had to pass. The adults in my family all carried passes marked with the zone or zones for which they were valid. My father and Yusuf had multi-zone passes, A, B, C, and D. The rest were restricted to 1 or perhaps 2 zones. Until I turned 12, I didn't need a pass, and so had been allowed to wander about freely with my cousins Albert and Robert. Gray and sober Jerusalem was a city tense with the politics of the time, as well as the religious competition between the various Christian communities and between Christians, Jews, and Muslims. My Aunt Nabiha, who was my father's sister, once gave us a big scolding for going to the Regent, a Jewish cinema. "Why not stick to the Arabs? Isn't the Rex good enough?" she asked rather shrilly. "After all, they don't come to our cinemas." And even though we were sorely tempted to go back to the Regent, we never did so again. Our daily conversation in school and home was uniformly in Arabic. Unlike in Cairo, where English was encouraged, our family in Jerusalem belonged, and our native language prevailed everywhere, even when talking about Hollywood films. Tarzan became Tarazan, and Laurel and Hardy, Al-Bans wal Rafi'a. Fatso and the Thin Man is the English translation. I went to St. George's School each morning, usually with my twin cousins, Robert and Albert. Always the leader, Albert was a captain and a star at the school, a year ahead of Robert, who was not athletic, and one of the boys, gregariously one of the boys. I was a junior figure, enrolled in the 7th primary, part of the lower school, across the street from the more elevated senior place where my 2 cousins studied. St. George's was the first all-male school I went to, and the first with which I had a deeper connection than with the ones in Cairo, where I was just a fees-paying stranger. My father, and I think my grandfather, had gone to St. George's, as had most male members of my family except Uncle Asad, who had been at Bishop Gobet's. For a couple of days, I felt that the absence of girls and women teachers gave the school a slightly harsher atmosphere, rougher, more physical, far less genteel than the establishments I had known in Cairo. But very quickly, I felt totally at home. For the first and last time in my school life, I was among boys who were like me. Nearly every member of my class was known to my family. For weeks after I started school, my parents, aunts, and Yusuf either asked me questions about, quote, the Safuri boy in your class, or made casual, well-informed comments about a Dajjani or Jamal classmate whose 107 parents or uncles and aunts were their friends. But then we left, and at the end of 1947, and came back to Cairo, and soon after that, the catastrophe happened, and Cairo was flooded with Palestinian refugees, and my Aunt Nabiha, I was going to read from this, but I'll pass on it, started to take care of them quite on her own. I mean, she was the first example I had. I was 12 and a half at the time, of somebody working for a Palestinian cause entirely out of a sense of service and devotion. I mean, she had no assistance. She was a well-off widow. Her children were grown, but what she did entirely on her own. And it was really the most lasting lesson I had in the sense of what it means to be a Palestinian and the destitution of the refugees. Now, in the meantime, because there are some people here who were in this place that my father used to like to take us to, a small village in Lebanon, to which we would constantly go, called Dur Shwer, and I'd like to read a passage about it. I must tell you honestly that although perhaps my sisters and my father, I know, liked Dur Shwer, my mother never did, although her mother's family came from the place. And I think I loathed it more than almost any other place I've ever been in. So don't expect anything very pleasant about Dur Shwer. So I'll just read a little bit about the kind of place it was. Okay. For our summers, we lived in an unfurnished, rented Dur house. Since despite his being well off, my father told me many times that he didn't trust real estate and consequently spent his life outside Palestine in rented residences. This was an important part of my parents' plan for summer living, and the houses were as plain, unadorned, and free of ornament or luxury as they could find. In 1944, a truckload of wooden furniture was being moved in just as we arrived that June. In stark contrast to the comfort and plushness of what we had left behind in Cairo, I saw a collection of rather rickety, splinter-filled, badly finished wooden cupboards, tables, and chairs that my father had ordered from Beirut. This ugly, Spartan furniture followed us around the various houses we rented in Dur until 1946, when we took the second floor of a big square house in an impressive terrace abode for the next 24 years, a house that we shared with a family that lived on the first floor, the Nassars. And one of the members of that family is here tonight. I haven't seen him in years and years and years, but this is now 1946. The 7 beds had identical metal frames hastily painted in a white that never stopped peeling, as well as formidable springs that looked like something out of a medieval torture chamber. The living room furniture was confected out of a couple of low day beds that my mother covered with something she had brought from Cairo, in addition to a few cushions slung across the wall behind them. There were no pictures anywhere. The idea was, my father's idea was, that we would lead an austere, rustic, minimally comfortable existence, stripped of any amenities that my father considered to be either too urban or too luxurious. We were not allowed to have a radio in the house until 1949. I vividly recall how on the cool August 1949 afternoon, when I first had the little radio to myself, I heard the BBC announce Richard Strauss's death, then crackle and fade gently off the air, and how when we returned to Cairo, I wrote in that date next to his name in my music encyclopedia. A telephone was allowed in around 1954 and a car in 1956. Except for our maids in Saf and later her sister Suad, our cook Hassan in the village, he was always referred to demeaningly by the natives as Al-Abd, the black slave, had to endure about 5 years of tour before my father allowed my mother some local help. An aged and wrinkled crone known as Imnijum, who did the washing and bread baking, and a different younger woman each year for general house cleaning and kitchen help. The electricity and hot water were highly unreliable, and a bath required several hours of wood burning in the mammoth azan, or stove. In 1953, at my mother's importuning, a spinet piano was rented for me to play, but it was installed in my room for fear that it might create too civilized an impression in the main room. For my father, the idea of Dur was to be as far away as possible in every sense from his Cairo business world and all that it entailed: cars, employees, phones, suits, papers, and the city. Rest, rest, rest. For him, this meant hours and hours spent either at the bridge table at the Hotel Salwa in the morning, or the Cirque Cafe in the afternoons, or playing tawla on the terrace with a local friend or a visitor from Beirut, Jerusalem, or even Cairo. And as for me, I was a problem, because there was the question of what I was supposed to be doing in a town without recreation of any sort. There was no club in those, especially in the 40s. It was very dry. There was no swimming pool. And I date from those days my rather cordial hatred of nature, which for me meant thorns and bees that stung you all the time. Anyway, my parents would say things like, "Go play in the forest." And my mother invented. I have to read you this passage. It's quite something. My mother invented a way of keeping me busy, which is to send me on errands. The town was quite long. It was very strung out, and she would send me to do things. There was no car, there was no phone, so I would have to be the errand boy. One hot weekend morning, she had sent me, weekday morning, she had sent me all the way from where we lived to the end of the town, I would say about a mile and a half, to the Hotel Assouf to take an electric iron wrapped in brown paper to a visiting friend from Cairo, Eugenie Farajallah. I returned home an hour and a half later, dead tired, thirsty from the long walk through a most unappealing landscape. There were no side roads to consider, no shady spots, no springs, no other pedestrians, not a cafe or restaurant, as I trudged along the endless narrow road heading east, all of it steep and barren. I remember also that this was the year my father had bought for me and insisted I wear a heavy khaki pith helmet. A salesman at Aviarino's, a men's shop in Cairo's Azbekiya district, had recommended to him for me while my father was buying a handsome Panama for himself. The helmet's inside band was disgustingly soggy with sweat as the ridiculous thing bore down on me, too cumbersome to take off and carry, hence fated to remain on me as I trudged along. As I wearily climbed the long, dusty stairs that led from Dhur's only road back to our house, I saw my mother standing on the balcony, dressed in a gray house dress without makeup, her hair wrapped in the turban she wore in those years, waving to me with what I'd hoped was a greeting on my return, but in fact was a hail to attract my attention, to intercept me before I too securely began to climb the final set of stairs onto the terrace. In her right hand, she was holding a black electrical cord. "Darling," she said to me in English, not always a good sign, "I forgot to give you the cord for the iron. What must Eugenie be thinking? Please take this back up to the Kassouf right away." A terrible feeling of fatigue and despondency overcame me as I trudged back up to take the cord to the woman. I think I'll just, I don't want to bore you or keep you, but I think, let me just talk about the last school I went to in quite an important school. It was called Victoria College. And this was the last 2 years of my life in the Middle East before I came to the U.S. in 1951. So this is 49 to 51. The last years of King Farouk, the last years of the British. And there was this school called Victoria College to which I was sent. I had tried to get into the English school, but which is where my sisters went, but I failed the entrance exam, typically, and sent instead to this place where where I was actually quite happy, despite the circumstances, which I'd like to tell you about. To impose coherence on the 1,000 or so boys of Victoria College, the authorities had divided us all into houses, which further inculcated and naturalized the ideology of empire. I was a member of Kitchener House. Other houses were Cromer, Frobisher, and Drake. Cairo VC was an altogether less posh school than its Alexandria parent, which had been in existence for 3 decades and had a much more imposing roster of students. King Hussein was one of them, and masters, and a very handsome spread of buildings and playing fields in the great Mediterranean summer capital. Our Shubra campus was makeshift, originally rented from the Italians during the war years to accommodate an overflow of students from Alexandria, which was principally a boarding institution. Most of the boys were day students from Cairo, less upper class and I suppose less accomplished than those from Alexandria. The classrooms and assembly hall were dingy and cramped, even though a permanent cloud of dust seemed settled over the place, even though 4 tennis courts and several football fields gave us outdoor facilities of a lavishness I had not before encountered. So I entered the class that I was assigned to called Middle 5. And there was a Mr. Keith Gatley, who was our form teacher, who was white-haired and portly with an enormous scar traversing his entire face diagonally. Like the other Britishers there, Gatley was an Oxbridgian who either had been marooned in Egypt by the war or had come there after the war in the absence of decent employment at home. Most of the staff were celibate and rumored among the students to be depraved pederasts. It was a constant war between us and the teachers who were all English, and all the students were not English. So we invented all these stories about them. We knew nothing about them, really, except that they seemed unpleasant. And as I say, we thought they were depraved pederasts who were able to indulge their illicit appetites among the vast court of servants and perhaps even the school's younger boys. Gatley was referred to as Il Khawal, or faggot. His dreadful scar, it was rumored, being the result of a fight with a pimp, whom, according to the same scar, there was no foundation for any of this, we made the story up. According to the same scurrilous report, Gatley had tried to cheat. Obviously, there was no way of knowing if any of this was true. I discovered most of this background during the first English class, which was devoted to Shakespeare's Twelfth Night, a highly inappropriate play for coarse teenagers for whom the music of love conjured only the rhythmic sound of a masturbating hand. Gatley asked us to read aloud and explain various lines in the first scene, but achieved only raucous laughter, incomprehensible gibberish, and horrendous Arabic obscenities presented as classical equivalents of what the Duke of Illyria was saying. All the scenes, dying falls, and entrances and abatement were explicated with scarcely concealed lewdness, while Gatley, whose nearsighted gaze shielded him from most of the class's gestures, you know, like fingers, and nodded lethargic approval of and vague assent to what he thought he was hearing. The last thing about Victoria College. There was a little pamphlet handed out to us called the School Handbook, which immediately turned us into natives. Rule 1 stated categorically, English is the language of the school. Anyone caught speaking other languages will be severely punished. So Arabic became our haven, a criminalized discourse where we took refuge from the world of masters and complicit prefects and anglicized older boys like Omar al-Sharif, who was the head boy. He was known then as Michel Chalhoub, who lorded over us as enforcers of the hierarchy and its rules. Because of Rule 1, we spoke more rather than less Arabic as an act of defiance. Certain masters, and so we would use Arabic in class as a way of, you know, dodging the teachers. Certain masters were especially vulnerable to this technique of using Arabic, preeminently a man called Mr. Mondrel, the unfortunate and bedraggled history teacher who may have been a victim of shell shock. A tremor animated his gnomic lethargy as he muttered facts about Tudor kings and Elizabethan customs before basically, I mean, we couldn't care less about Elizabethan king. In answer to one of his questions, a student would begin by suavely mouthing an Arabic imprecation, kusummak, sir, immediately followed by a loose translation, it means, in other words, sir, that had nothing to do with the foul phrase, which really meant, as you all know, your mother's cunt. As the class roared their appreciation, Mr. Mondrel would jerk backward in fear and astonishment. We would also play a game called Akhir Kilma with him, repeating in unison the last word in every one of his sentences. For example, Elizabeth's reign was notable for culture and exploration, one of his typically torpid sentences, would draw a resounding chorus of the word exploration from us, which Mondrel would ignore for about 6 sentences before exploding in a roar of shaking, spastic rage, which in turn drew delighted cheers from us. By the middle of the term, he had given up trying to communicate, sitting sulkily in his chair, mumbling about the regicide and Cromwell's revolution. I think if I might just conclude by reading the last pages of the book, which are about my mother's last days. It took years after the end of my formal education. I came to America. I went to Princeton and then to Harvard. It took years after the end of my formal education for me to realize how much my mother had, whether by design or instinct, I shall never know, insinuated herself not just into our affairs as 4 sisters and a brother, but also between us. Some of these barriers between us as siblings are immovable, which I regret. Perhaps they exist in all families. But I also realize now that our odd family cocoon back then was no model for future lives, nor was the world we lived in. I think that my father must have sensed that when, at inordinate expense, he did the totally unheard of things and sent 4 of us to the United States for our education. The more I think about it, the more I believe he thought the only hope for me as a man was in fact to be cut off from my family. My search for freedom for the self beneath or obscured by Edward could have only begun because of that rupture. So I have come to think of it as fortunate, despite the loneliness and unhappiness I experienced for so long. Now it doesn't seem important or even desirable to be right and in place, right at home, for instance. Better to wander out of place, not to own a house, and not ever to feel too much at home anywhere, especially in a city like New York, where I shall be until I die. During the last months of my mother's life, she would tell me plaintively and frequently about the misery of trying to fall asleep. She was in Washington, I in New York. We would speak constantly, see each other about once a month. Her cancer was spreading, I knew. She refused to have chemotherapy. ما بدي أتعذب, she would say. I don't want the torture of it. Years later, I was to have 4 wasting years of chemotherapy. I have leukemia, with no success. But she never buckled, never gave in, even to her doctor's importunings, never had chemotherapy. But she couldn't sleep at night. Sedatives, sleeping pills, soothing drinks, the counsel of friends and relatives, reading, praying, none, she said, did any good. Help me to sleep, Edward, she once said to me, with a piteous trembling in her voice that I can still hear as I write. But then the disease spread into her brain, and for the last 6 weeks she slept all the time. Waiting by the bed for her to awaken with my sister Grace was for me the most anguished and paradoxical of my experiences with her. Now I've divined that my own inability to sleep may be her last legacy to me, a counter to her struggle for sleep. For me, sleep is something to be gotten over as quickly as possible. I can only go to bed very late, but I'm up literally at dawn. Like her, I don't possess the secret of long sleep, although unlike her, I've reached the point where I don't want it. For me, sleep is death, as is any diminishment in awareness. During my last treatment, last year, a 12-week ordeal, I was most upset by the drugs I was given to ward off fever and shaking chills, which is when I understood, by the way, these shaking chills that I would get like that, which is why when I understood why the Israelis used it as torture. I was upset by the drugs I was given to ward off fever and shaking chills, which I got a lot of the time, and manifestly upset by the induced somnolence, the sense of being infantilized, the helplessness that many years ago I had conceded as that of a child to my mother and differently to my father. I fought the medical soporifics bitterly, as if my identity depended on that resistance, even to my doctor's advice. Sleeplessness for me is a cherished state to be desired at almost any cost. There's nothing for me as invigorating as immediately shedding the shadowy half-consciousness of a night's loss than the early morning, reacquainting myself with or resuming what I might have lost completely a few hours earlier. I occasionally experience myself as a cluster of flowing currents. I prefer this to the idea of a solid self, the identity to which so many attach so much significance. These currents, like the themes of one's life, flow along during the waking hours, and at their best, they require no reconciling, no harmonizing. They are off, and maybe out of place, but at least they're always in motion, in time, in place, in the form of all kinds of strange combinations moving about, not necessarily forward, sometimes against each other, contrapuntally, yet without one central theme. A form of freedom, I'd like to think, even if I'm far from being totally convinced that it is. That skepticism, too, is one of the themes I particularly want to hold on to. With so many dissonances in my life, I've learned actually to prefer being not quite right and out of place. Thank you. We have time for, I guess, thank you very much. Thank you. I think we have time for some questions, yeah, if you'd like.
If there are any questions, people can step to this aisle and use this microphone.
But don't ask me if you can get a discount.
Welcome. I want to touch on the issue of the Edward Said name which you presented, and being of the same generation, you and me, I could understand...
You look younger than me, actually.
Beg pardon?
You look younger.
I am really older. I've read a couple of pages and the dates in the book. I'm a bit older.
Okay.
So let me get that through, yeah. So what many classmates in my high school or college who had their names like Edwards or Georges or Alberts usually were occasionally teased by us for their foreign name. Right. But, you know, if one looks at the Arabic literature, You know, there is a very famous poet in the Arabic language, As-Samawal. He is very well known for his great poetry in the Arabic language, and very few people know that he is a Jew, and his original name is Samuel. And you know, one of his famous poems is إذا المرء لم يدنس من اللؤم عرضه فكل رداء يرتديه جميل. So I am sure, because the Arabic language has Arabized,
yes,
even a Jewish poet contributor to the Arabic language, with your record of activism and promotion for just causes, I am sure in the future, whenever you're intolerant of the name Edward, the future generations of the Arabic language can always make a change. Dwar of your mother
exactly,
is a very good name. Let me suggest, for example, very close to Edward is Dwar or Duwair. You know, Duwair is a diminution of Dair.
Yeah, but I didn't know all this.
You did or you didn't?
No, I didn't.
Okay.
No, I mean, I was describing a feeling I had when I was a kid.
I am just suggesting name for the future as Duwair,
yeah,
so that's how Edward Said might be referred to in the next century.
Yeah, right. Well.
And I am sure people would find similar good Arabic names for activists who are dedicated to just causes, like many of them present here, like the Clovis Maqsouds and the Alberts Mukhebers and the Ralph Naders over there.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Right. Well, you know, it's interesting. The difference is between my generation and my son's generation is that my wife and I called our son Wadia. So, I mean, you know, of course he was named after my father, but my father, whose name was Wadia, when he came to America, anglicized his name, or it was anglicized for him, I was never clear about that, to William. So officially on his passport he was referred to as William Said, although his real name was Wadia. I think there's now a general feeling that you can have any name you like, and it doesn't have to conform. But in those days, somehow I felt that having that English name in that setting was something that, you know, put me apart, and it was something that I found very difficult to deal with. But I got over it afterwards.
I think to recruit your son so that we'll work together with him to make your name Dwyer.
Yeah. Okay.
Professor Said, I don't have a question. I have more of a comment.
Oh dear.
And since you, an anecdote. Since you didn't bring it up, I feel a little bad myself mentioning it. But I feel solidarity with you because the man who slandered you was my teacher in Tel Aviv University. And
Which university?
In Tel Aviv University, Justice Wiener. The man who slandered you, Justice Wiener, was my teacher at Tel Aviv University, and I thought you'd be interested in knowing just what kind of a teacher he was.
Try me.
We were studying comparative law, but most of the class was taken up by rather cheap attempts at propaganda to convince us that all the crimes alleged to have been committed by the Israelis were not crimes. So he would show us videos of Amnesty International of Israeli soldiers beating Palestinians, and he'd twist himself into pretzels of excuses, explaining how this angle of this isn't a just depiction of the Israeli soldier beating the Palestinian, and it doesn't actually show that the soldiers are just, or things of that nature. Or he would spend most of the class justifying administrative detention as being legal.
Yeah, actually a friend of mine, whom some of you know, Norman Finkelstein, is researching. I mean, it's his turn to be researched now. And he's found quite extraordinary, well, actually corresponds to what you described. He's found some extraordinary papers that he wrote in law journals, I mean, fairly respectable law journals at Iowa and Cornell and so on and so forth, mainly justifying the policies of Rabin during the Intifada, you know, breaking their bones and that sort of thing, and saying that it wasn't unjust and so on and so forth. Yeah, he's quite, and he's American, I believe, also, isn't he?
Yes, he's one of those American Jews who came to Israel to help the Jews.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Thank you.
Saeed, would you comment on the commentary article that denies you are a Palestinian?
Not particularly, no. I mean, it's just, well, we were just talking about it now. I don't really know what to say about it. I mean, it's a kind of ridiculous thing that this man who is just described as a law professor at Tel Aviv University claims, since I never met him, and he never called me, which I found quite extraordinary, that he researched the first few years of my life and discovered that I didn't know exactly what he was trying to prove, because he couldn't prove that I wasn't Palestinian because I was born there, but he wanted to prove that I spent more time outside of Palestine than inside. And I guess the idea behind that is to try to discredit the Palestinian narrative, which I think is very, very, very hard for a lot of Israelis to accept, that there were people who lived there and had lives. Many of us, I mean, my generation certainly, and older generations, lived in Palestine and moved easily throughout the Middle East. That it was really only after Israel was established that you had these separations between states and and borders that grew into impassable barriers between peoples and between nationalities. And I think since one of the fields that this man is an expert on is the question of compensation to the Palestinians, the idea is, like Joan Peters a few years ago, was to prove that Palestinians were never there, therefore they're not entitled to compensation. And since this is an issue that is now going to be negotiated between the Palestinians and the Israelis, one of the final status issues is compensation and right of return. So to create a fuss about where Palestinians are and where they came from, to obscure the fact that so many Israelis who had no connection to Palestine, any Jew anywhere, according to the law of return, can go back and live. But even if I was born there, I can't go back. And that's what I think that's part of the story that I tell in my book, that even though my father was an American citizen, my mother wasn't American. My mother was Palestinian. She had a Palestinian passport. And so when we left Palestine in 1947, her passport was useless. And for at least 10 years after that, she had tremendous problems moving around. She had the difficulties, of course, she was insulated from, the terrible deprivation of most, I would say, the vast majority of Palestinian refugees. But being stateless and being without a country, being dispossessed, which happened to us too, because my father's business in Palestine and all the property we owned, as so many other people, was lost forever. And I think the idea is to try to in articles like this, because, I'm well-known or whatever, to discredit the story. And I think that's the most important thing. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to tell my story. I thought that it's important that people understand that ordinary Palestinians have lives. And that from the very beginning, even though I was a kid at the time, I was only 12, and even though my family was not at all political, we all, even the ones of us who are more privileged, and I never said about myself that I was a destitute refugee, but by the end of the spring of 1948, my entire extended family, all my relatives, had disappeared from Palestine. They were all driven out. And that's something that I think Israelis and, frankly, many American Jews who support Israel find very difficult to accept. And part of the attack, I think, has to do with that, to obscure that, say it's a lie, it's made up, it's not true. But the fact is that Palestinians are dispossessed from the ordinary citizen to the highest citizen. They were all dispossessed as a people, and the society was destroyed. And the portrait I try to show in my book of what happened, even from the point of view of a kid who wasn't really that affected by it, in the people around us, my relatives, I describe in the book, for example, how people I had seen in Palestine, cousins of my father, for example, never recovered. I have an uncle, my mother's slightly older brother, who represents for me the tragedy of the Palestinian, because he was driven out. And I remember I was at his wedding in 1946, and he was married in Haifa, and there's a picture of the wedding in the book here. He then left Palestine, he came to Egypt, first to Alexandria, then to Cairo. He then moved to Baghdad, Then he came to Beirut, and because of the Lebanese civil war and the impossibility, he was getting old at the time of working, he left. He now lives in Seattle, Washington. And for me, that's the typical story. Not being able to return, permanently isolated and in exile. And that's a very difficult story for people who celebrate Israel as the great, marvelous society. I mean, it's achieved many important things for Jews, but one of the prices that Israel has exacted from Palestinians is this state of dispossession. And I think anything that represents that has to be difficult for some people, as it is for this man.
Dr. Said, I am from another part of the world, not from the Middle East, and I believe you had a dear friend to whom you dedicated your book, Culture and Imperialism. He was a teacher of mine and a colleague.
Iqbal Ahmed, yeah.
Iqbal Ahmed.
Great.
The point I want to raise is, which probably is dealt in Culture and Imperialism, which is a fascinating book, and I remember having spent a year reading the book. I'm not from the academia. I do some business, but on the side I write and, of course, read. The point I'm trying to raise is that when I heard of the title of your book, Out of Place, I thought you were probably referring to your life in America. But then I found out that it was a biography of your earlier years.
Yes, but also I'm sorry, I gave the wrong impression from the passages I chose, but the last third of the book is about my early years in America. Part of it also, I think, was the peculiar education that I had, and I think to a certain degree Iqbal had, for example, that we went to schools that taught us more about other places than about the place we lived in. I mean, but when I left, and really until after I got my PhD, I knew very, very little about the Arab world, although I lived there. All of my education was in English. All of my training was about, for example, I knew, as a person from the subcontinent, this will interest you, in these English schools I went to, whether in Palestine or in Egypt, we knew more about India than we knew more about the Arab world. It's quite extraordinary, because of course, India was, central to the British Empire, and the idea that India was ours was inculcated to us by the teachers. It was quite an extraordinary thing. So, as a result of that, you're torn away from what were your roots. It's not the experience of everyone, obviously, because people did also go to local or government schools, but large numbers of people were trained at these English schools, many of them to become the leaders of the Arab world. I mentioned King Hussein, but others, prime ministers and many of the current Saudi grandees, I mean, people who are important in the government and the country, were all students, as well as from Iraq, Syria, etc., all went to that kind of school. And some of them, to this day, still feel closer to England than they do to their own country. So it's that kind of alienation that I was talking about.
Right, I see. But however, the point I sort of wanted to emphasize is that in America, you do have a chance of, I think it's an Israeli poet who wrote that it's very difficult to have two landscapes in one life.
Yes.
Meaning thereby that, but I think this is a country where it is.
In other parts of the world, I think it's just one big thing that's all the same called America. But America itself is so diverse. There's so many different ethnic groups and currents. I mean, there's obviously an establishment, but there's also a dissenting, important dissenting community in this country, and so on and so forth.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Maybe, I don't know, I think maybe we should we, Bridget? Yeah, stop now. Yeah, so I will turn myself off now. I may. Thank you.
Your buying patterns do not match the average book buyers. Consequently, we're out of the hardcover